Alright, so this Knife Thoughts video is going to be a look at this knife and the history of this pattern. And real quick, this is a companion video to an article that I have on my website, knifethoughts.com. So if you're interested in a little bit more in-depth discussion and some pictures related to this pattern, make sure you check that article out at knifethoughts.com. But this is the WayNorth Cutlery Real Lambfoot Knife. It's made by Great Eastern Cutlery on their 93 frame, and the Tang model number is 933119, which means it's the 93 pattern. The 3 stands for a Sheetfoot blade in Great Eastern Cutlery's Tang number chart system. So they didn't give the Lambfoot blade its own number designation. And then the 1 stands for it's a single blade, and the 19 for it being made in 2019. And as you can see, I have the smooth white bone version. Real quick, I wanted to show the back of the tube. This is a special factory order for Charlie Campagna. And it is the first knife, or this run of knives is the first knives that have his WayNorth Cutlery stamp. And he always does a really nice write-up on the back of the knife, so you can pause this and check that out if you'd like. But before I get into this knife and the history of the pattern, I want to make sure to say real quick that what I'm going to say in this is not necessarily objective fact. There's very little, if any, first-hand documents relating to the origins of this pattern. The only real first-hand documents are pictures of catalogs that show Lambfoot knives. And so most of it is what you might call educated guesses or educated conjectures based on the surrounding history at the same time that this knife was being, or this pattern was being, kind of created and coming to prominence. So real quick, first let's take a look at the knife itself and say, what is a Lambfoot knife? So here's the knife, and first thing you might notice is that it is a swayback type handle or frame. So the butt of the knife sits out of center with the pivot towards the spring side. Now, that's usually the case on a Lambfoot knife, but not always the case. There are examples of Lambfoot knives that don't have this handle frame shape. You also see that it is a single blade, but that again is most often, but not always the case. There are examples in history of more multi-bladed knives with Lambfoot blades. But a Lambfoot is really defined by the blade shape. So we'll take a look at that. And what it is, and again, it actually gave a little bit of a rundown on that in this write-up, is it is a straight edged knife. So you can see there's no belly to the edge. And the spine of the knife is straight, but angled towards the edge. So it is not parallel with the edge. That's really one of, if not the main defining characteristic of the Lambfoot blade. So this main length of the spine is angled downward toward the edge or toward the tip. And then it comes to what is a rounded corner and then a shorter edge of spine that meets with the tip. So to give you some comparisons here, a Sheetfoot blade, which is again what Great Eastern Cutlery designated this as, is a little different. A Sheetfoot blade still has that rounded corner, but instead of the spine angling downward towards the edge or towards the tip, it's parallel with the edge. And Great Eastern Cutlery did a different knife on this frame that they called a Lambfoot, which is another, maybe variation of a Sheetfoot where the spine actually angled away from the edge. But a Sheetfoot usually has a spine that is parallel with the edge, and then it still has that rounded corner here. Then a Wharncliffe blade, which is another kind of adjacent blade shape, doesn't have that rounded corner. It has more of a swept corner. So it's not an abrupt corner that then turns into a straight spine connecting to that corner to the main spine. A Wharncliffe usually will have some straight spine and then a pretty wide angle that continuously curves down to the point. So some differences there between the Wharncliffe and Sheetfoot and the Lambfoot. And like I said, the Lambfoot knife is mostly defined by this blade shape. There are different handle and blade configurations that can happen, although it is usually this sway back handle frame and a single blade. So that's what a Lambfoot knife is. And so now we can get into the possible origins of the pattern, the name and design. So it's a little bit difficult to nail this down. Like I said, there really aren't any specifics, any first-hand documents. We don't, have a specific maker or manufacturer who originated this knife. But there's a couple things that we can infer. So first of all, there are no clear examples of a Lambfoot in an industry pattern catalog that was created in 1816 called Smith's Key. And this showed a really wide range of different spring knives or slip joints, and none of them really were Lambfoot knives. And then going into the late 19th century, so 1896, there is a catalog from Taylor's Eyewitness that very clearly and obviously shows a Lambfoot knife. And then there are more and more in the early 20th century. So we know that it wasn't around in the early 1800s, but was in the very late 1800s. And then another indication, which I'll talk about a little bit later more, is that it doesn't show up in America. But the second thing here that might be an indication of how this knife came about is the fact that these knives often had a stamp or etch that said real Lambfoot knife. And you can just barely still see that there. I hope you can see it a little bit. Real Lambfoot, I think, yeah, knife, there we go. And the interesting thing with that is that it may have been a reaction to the fact that there are a lot of copies and trademark infringements happening in the knife industry in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So that might have been a way to, differentiate the knives at that time. Along with that, that may contribute to the, emergence of this kind of modified blade shape because it may be a modified sheetfoot. Now, it could be a modified, what's sometimes called a short beak blade, which is similar to the ancient Barlow that Charlie Campagna had made, but it is also, very probable that it is a modified sheepfoot. And it may have been a way to create a different knife that was unique and, therefore gain a little bit of ground in marketing and sales. But again, that's just conjecture. There's nothing, there's no lawsuits to be found that specifically name the real Lambfoot knife or anything like that. The other thing with the name is that being that it is similar to a sheepfoot, and I'll show you a different sheepfoot. This is another Charlie Campagna SFO. This is a TC Barlow. A sheepfoot is maybe like a more robust or less slender Lambfoot. So the Lambfoot is a little bit more slender. And it might have been named the Lambfoot because a lamb is a juvenile sheep. Now again, that's conjecture. There's no specific, first-hand documents to show that, but it seems to make sense that, a wider blade that's called a sheepfoot, if you make a more slender version of it, it makes sense to call it a Lambfoot. So those are just some of the possible, kind of factors that could have contributed to this knife having this design and this name. Now, one other thing, and this is completely, from my use of this knife, one reason why I think that this might have this sway back handle is that it is a knife that is often used by gardeners and, animal husbandry people in agriculture. Specifically, some catalogs from knife companies called this a hoof rot knife or a lamb tailing knife, so cutting the tails off of lambs or cutting the hoof rot off of a sheep's hoof. And one of the things that I find in my use of this knife especially with gardening, I haven't cut any lamb's tails off or, cut any hoof rot, but I can imagine that it has the same type of application, is that in gardening, when you're using this knife and you're using it for pull cuts, it feels good and ergonomic in the hand to actually hold it opposite or edge inward. And that makes for really easy pull cuts. And like I said, I've used it a lot like that in gardening. And this handle shape really lends itself to that. You can get a good grip here. The wider butt sits well at the end of your hand. And even for normal cutting, it feels good for that type of cutting, so holding this butt into the palm of your hand. So again, this is just something that I've seen from my own use, not from any historical data, but it seems to make sense that they would typically have this sway back handle because it lends itself to the types of uses that Lambfoot seems to most often have in the garden or in agriculture. But like I said, the true or original origins of the name and design are lost to history. We don't know what company first made it or where it first showed up or who designed it or anything like that. So why is this knife so special? This knife, this WayNorth Lambfoot, was one of the most sought after knives probably in Great Eastern Cutlery history, definitely in 2019. And that's saying something because a lot of Great Eastern Cutlery knives are highly sought after. And the reason is really because this is the first Lambfoot knife to be made in America. Now, there have been some people I've seen on forums who've said, that there are some knives that might toe the line, have blades that might toe the line of maybe being a Lambfoot, but there's no clear definitive Lambfoot that was made in America until this knife. And that's really kind of unique and special because so many other Sheffield patterns did come to America, and also, this knife existed for at least 100 years before it was made in America. So why is that? Why wouldn't this knife have been made in America before then? Well, there's a lot of reasons, and again, there's no clear reasons, no definite a manufacturer or a company in Sheffield put out a paper saying we're not making a Lambfoot and sending it to America, or an American company saying, we're not going to make a Lambfoot for these reasons. But there's a couple things that we can kind of infer and guess at. So one of those, like I mentioned earlier, is that a lot of the American cutlery firms were founded before this knife was likely created. So in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, around that area, a lot of cutlers immigrated to the United States from the UK. And they are the ones who started the earliest United States-based manufacturers of knives. So they would have come over before this knife was created, and definitely before it was popularized. So by the time this knife was created and popularized, those manufacturers and the American cutlery industry in general would have been well established, and kind of taste would have already been established within the American consumer market as well. So that's one possible reason. Now, another possible reason is that in the 1890s, and specifically in 1890, there was a tariff act. So McKinley enacted a tariff act that brought the tax on imports to the U.S. up to between 38 to 49% on average, which is a huge tax. And so what that might have done is kind of pushed the Sheffield and generally the UK knife manufacturers away from focusing on the American market. So they may have focused more so on their former colonies. So, for example, you can find examples of Lambfoot knives that were made in or sent to Australia, as well as some, less so, but some in Canada. So it might have made more sense for those manufacturers to focus on those markets that wouldn't have been subject to such high taxes as the American market. Another thing, and this is an interesting thing to me from a historical standpoint, is that there's also just kind of a difference in preference for blade shapes between the American market and the UK market. And so one of the reasons for that might be because those tastes were established in America before the UK market shifted towards this type of blade. But I think that's less so. I think that the United Kingdom's market was already more focused on this type of blade, a straight edge blade, than America's market became. More so, and more interestingly, there's the idea of the difference in uses that the American and UK markets would have. So specifically, curved edge knives, so something like a clip point or a spear point. I actually don't have a traditional spear point out, but you can see that blade shaped like a spear point has maintained popularity on something like a very modern Cold Steel Code 4. But a curved edge knife like a clip point or a spear point or even a pen blade are more useful for tasks that you might do in the outdoors, the wilderness, like skinning, trapping, hunting, carving, things like that, than a straight edge knife. And those types of uses would have been more common in the United States, where there was more wilderness still at the time, and people did more of those types of things. And along with that, and again, interestingly from the historical perspective, is the fact that hunting was much and is much more of a widespread pastime and also way of getting food for your family in the United States than in the UK. So in the United States, there's a lot more big game than in the UK, and also there's a difference in the legality. In the UK, historically, and for a long time, it has been in many places illegal to hunt and to kill the game because the game is actually owned by the royalty or the aristocrats, whereas in the United States, that's really not the case. I mean, we have to get hunting licenses, but it's certainly not the same thing. You're not going to get put to death for killing a deer. So that's an interesting difference that may have led to something with a straight edge like this being less popular. Now, you do see straight edge knives in the United States. You see Sheetfoots and pruning knives and things like that. But you don't see this knife, so I think that it's probably a combination of the timing, where this knife was created a little later than those previous blade shapes like a Sheetfoot, clip point, spear point, or pen blade, or even pruning blade, a hawkbill, and also the differences in needs and uses in the two different markets. So again, this is all something where there's no specifics, there's no market data that any cutlery firms took to that we can look at to say, this is why. But it's some things that I think are, educated guesses, educated conjecture about the reasons why this pattern may not have shown up in the United States for over 100 years. So again, that's why this knife is so special. And this knife in particular is extra special to me because this is a special version, a unique version that there are only, I think, 27 or so, 27, 28, made of for the 2019 Rendezvous. And I was able to purchase it directly from Charlie. I've had the great, opportunity, the great pleasure of talking with Charlie at several of the rendezvous. And he's always extremely helpful, knowledgeable, and just, a really pleasure to talk with. And so I was really happy to be able to buy this knife from him and, put it in my pocket. And I have. That's another thing I wanted to say about this knife. This knife was one of my most carried knives in 2020, and one of my most used knives for sure. Now, it looks pretty, unpatinaed, and that's because I recently, for the new year, flitzed and oiled most of my carbon steel knife, or all of my carbon steel knives. But I have used this knife a lot, and I really enjoy using it. Now, one thing I do want to point out that the Lambfoot purists out there are definitely not fans of is that I added a little pseudo easy open notch. Now, I don't know if you've noticed it previously because, as you can see, it's not a true easy open notch, so you actually don't see it on the outline or the frame of the knife when looking directly at it. It just gives a little bit more room for me to get my kind of thick, hefty thumb in there to open the blade, because the blade does sit pretty low in the handle, which I actually like. You'll be able to use this knife and sharpen it for a long time without worrying about the tip becoming proud. So like I've said, I've used this knife for gardening, for general use, and have really enjoyed it, and it's one that I'm really happy to have. And the reason I wanted to do this video and the related article is because it's really difficult to find information on this Lambfoot pattern on the internet. I don't want to get too much into this, but the only real place, like I said, that you can find information is on a thread on BladeForums called Guardians of the Lambfoot. And there is a huge amount of information, and the people are extremely knowledgeable. But there's like 46,000 plus posts, and the posts happen very quickly. So unless you are checking BladeForums every day consistently, you're not going to be able to keep up with it, or it's very difficult to keep up with. It's difficult to navigate because there are so many posts. There's an index that you can use, but it's labeled but not without descriptions. And there's like dozens, if not hundreds, of links. And it's frankly, in my opinion, a little bit difficult to interact with. I have posted there and haven't had always a lot of great responses, but that might be my fault for the way I've posted. But I do think that it's difficult to find the information because there is so many posts. And I hate to see something that a lot of people are really interested in, which is this pattern, the Lambfoot, be something that it's difficult or impossible to find information on because of the barriers to finding that information. So I wanted to do an article and video on this knife and on this pattern, even if, like I've said many times, the content that I'm presenting or the information that I'm presenting here isn't necessarily 100% historical fact. Even if it's conjecture or educated guesses, I think it's interesting to people, and I think people want to hear this type of thing, and can't always spend the time and effort and energy that it takes to find it on the forums. So I hope that this video and the related article are interesting. I hope that they're helpful. And one more time, realize that this is just my opinions, my guesses, based on the research I've done, again, mostly on that BladeForums thread. But mostly, I just really like this knife. I have considered getting other Lambfoots before. It is a little bit difficult to get other Lambfoot knives because they are all made in the United Kingdom. And there's not a whole lot of US-based sellers who sell the United Kingdom-made knives. So I haven't gotten one yet, but I still am considering getting one and hoping to, or might in 2021 here. So again, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope it's been helpful. And if you have enjoyed it, go ahead and like it. Subscribe to my channel. I have lots of other videos. Also check out my website, knifethoughts.com, again, where I have an article on this knife and pattern, as well as lots of other articles. And also check me out on social media, Instagram, Facebook, and everything like that, at Knife Thoughts. And last but not least, don't forget, as always, to go out and do good.